They don't avoid eye contact because they don't care. They avoid it because they remember. At first, the change feels subtle, almost easy to dismiss. They're still there. They still show up. They still speak. But something in the air has shifted. Conversations feel flatter. Pauses stretch longer than they used to. And the most telling detail is the one you notice only after it keeps happening. Their eyes no longer meet yours, not naturally, not comfortably, not the way they once did. This distance is confusing because it doesn't come with a clear explanation. There's no argument, no dramatic ending, no obvious betrayal. They are physically present, but emotionally unreachable, like someone standing behind glass. You can see them, hear them, sense their proximity, but you can't reach them anymore. And the instinctive response is to assume you did something wrong, that you said too much, asked for too much, needed too much. But that assumption is the lie that keeps people stuck. The truth is quieter and more unsettling. They didn't pull away because you failed. They pulled away because something inside them woke up. A memory, a feeling, a recognition they had been postponing. Eye contact isn't just visual connection, it's emotional exposure. It invites presence. It demands truth in a way words don't. And honesty is the one place avoidants were never trained to survive. Their nervous system learned early that closeness equals danger, that being seen leads to loss of control, expectation, or pain. When they look at you, they don't just see who you are now. They see who they were with you, the version of themselves that felt, that softened, that almost stayed, and that is intolerable. Because remembering means acknowledging that what existed was real and that running from it had consequences. Avoidants are skilled at compartmentalizing emotions, but eye contact collapses those compartments. It brings everything into one moment, one exchange, one undeniable truth. So they look away, not out of indifference, but out of self-protection. Looking at you forces them to acknowledge what they felt and what they ran from at the same time. It forces them to sit with the contrast between connection and escape, between intimacy and fear, and that internal conflict has nowhere to go except inward. Avoidance becomes the only strategy that keeps their system from flooding. This is why the shift feels so personal, even though it isn't. You didn't lose value. You became a mirror, a reminder of something unresolved. And for someone whose entire survival strategy depends on emotional distance, being reminded is far more threatening than being abandoned. The uncomfortable truth is this: if they truly felt nothing, they could look at you without hesitation. The avoidance isn't proof of your insignificance, it's evidence of impact. Avoidant guilt isn't emotional, it's evasive. When guilt finally surfaces, it doesn't arrive with tears or confessions. It doesn't sound like remorse or look like accountability. It arrives disguised as caution. They don't come back apologetic, they come back careful, measured, controlled. Every word feels edited before it leaves their mouth, as if they're walking through a room filled with emotional tripwires. The conversations change first. They're shorter now, trimmed down to what's necessary. There's less warmth, less curiosity, less openness. The energy that once flowed naturally is replaced with something tighter, more restrained. You feel it most in the silences. Not peaceful silences, tense ones, the kind that hum with things that aren't being said. It's not that they have nothing to say, it's that saying it would require them to look too closely at what they did. For an avoidant, guilt doesn't present as regret in the traditional sense. Regret asks for repair. Guilt asks for reflection, and reflection is dangerous territory for someone who learned to survive by disconnecting from their inner world. Instead of turning inward, they turn away. They distract. They minimize. They keep interactions surface level so nothing deeper gets activated. This is why their behavior can feel so confusing. If they truly didn't care, they'd be relaxed. Indifference is easy, but what you're sensing isn't indifference, it's restraint. A subtle bracing against emotion. They are managing themselves around you, carefully controlling proximity so nothing spills over. Guilt for them isn't a feeling to be processed. It's a threat to emotional equilibrium. Avoidant guilt lives in the body, not the words. It shows up as guarded posture, broken eye contact, and emotional withdrawal masked as calm. They may even appear polite, respectful, or overly neutral. But neutrality isn't peace, it's containment. They are keeping something locked down because opening it would force them to confront an image they've worked hard to avoid. Because if they fully see you, your steadiness, your clarity, your unchanged capacity for connection, they'd have to see themselves in contrast. They'd have to face the ways they withdrew, minimized, or walked away from something real. And that self-recognition is heavier than distance ever was. So they choose the quieter option, not repair, not honesty, just enough space to keep the mirror from forming. You didn't hurt them by leaving. You hurt them by staying kind. That's the part that rarely gets named. They expected anger, distance, punishment, something that would justify their withdrawal. Instead, you remain steady, calm, human. And that quiet kindness became the most confronting thing you could have offered because it removed the narrative they needed to survive their choice. You represent a version of love they couldn't tolerate. Not dramatic, not chaotic, not conditional, but stable, consistent, unthreatening. The kind of connection that doesn't demand intensity to prove its value. For someone with an avoidant nervous system, that kind of love feels unfamiliar, even unsafe. There's no adrenaline to hide behind, no volatility to blame, just presence. And presence requires participation. That's why your existence becomes unbearable. Not because you hurt them, but because you didn't. You didn't collapse, you didn't chase, you didn't harden. You adapted without becoming bitter. And that forces a reckoning they weren't prepared for. Because if you're okay, then the story that they had to leave to protect themselves starts to fall apart. Your calm exposes their chaos in ways words never could. You don't need to point out the contrast. It speaks for itself. You regulate your emotions while theirs remain reactive. You can sit in silence without shutting down. You can feel without disappearing. That difference isn't theoretical to them. It's visceral. They feel it in their body when they're near you. A quiet tension that says, this is what stability looks like, and this is where I fall short. Your steadiness highlights what they couldn't hold, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how. Avoidants are often skilled at longing from a distance, but struggle with sustaining connection in real time. When love stops being a chase and starts being a place to land, their system doesn't relax, it panics. Stability removes the familiar excuses. There's nothing to push against, nothing to rebel from, nothing to escape except themselves. So they look away, not from you, but from the comparison you represent. Being around you makes them aware of their own fragmentation, of the emotional skills they never developed, of the intimacy they crave, but don't know how to stay inside. Distance becomes the only way to quiet that internal discomfort. This is why your presence feels heavier than your absence ever did. Absence allows fantasy. Presence demands reality. And reality, in this case, reflects a version of themselves they're not ready to face. You don't threaten them by existing, you threaten them by being whole without them. And that, more than any argument or goodbye, is what truly triggers an avoidant nervous system. They avoid your eyes because their nervous system still recognizes you. That recognition doesn't come from memory or logic, it comes from the body. Avoidants are often skilled at disconnecting cognitively. They can explain away feelings, minimize experiences, and rationalize distance with impressive clarity. But biology doesn't follow the same rules. The body keeps its own record, and it doesn't erase safety just because the mind decides it's inconvenient. Avoidants disconnect mentally, not biologically, long after they've told themselves they're fine, that it didn't matter, that it wasn't real. Their nervous system still responds to you as familiar, regulating, no. There was a time when your presence calmed something in them, even if they couldn't name it. And that imprint doesn't disappear simply because the relationship changed or ended. It waits, widely, until proximity brings it back online. This is where the conflict begins. Eye contact activates intimacy. It's immediate and involuntary. A brief meeting of the eyes can trigger the same physiological responses as emotional closeness, slowed breathing, heightened awareness, vulnerability. For someone wired to equate intimacy with danger, that activation doesn't feel warm. It feels threatening. Intimacy activates fear. Fear activates shutdown. And shutdown looks a lot like disinterest. to the untrained eye. So they glance past you instead of at you. They keep their gaze moving, their posture angled away, their attention split. They talk around you instead of to you, staying on safe topics that don't require presence. They disappear inside themselves while technically remaining in the room. It's not a conscious choice, it's a reflex. Their system is doing exactly what it learned to do when closeness feels like too much. What's important to understand is that this reaction isn't proof that the connection meant nothing. If anything, it suggests the opposite. The body doesn't activate around neutrality. It activates around familiarity, attachment, and unresolved bonds. If you were truly insignificant, their nervous system would stay calm. There would be no internal spike, no need to manage themselves, no reason to withdraw. This is why their behavior can feel so contradictory. One moment, they seem distant and cold. The next, there's a flicker of softness they quickly suppress. That flicker isn't confusion, it's recognition. And recognition overwhelms them because it bypasses the mental defenses they rely on. The body remembers safety even when the mind rejects it. So no, it's not indifference, it's overload. Overload from unresolved attachment, from emotional memories that were never integrated, from a system that learned to survive by shutting down when closeness resurfaced. Their avoidance isn't a lack of feeling, it's a protective response to feeling too much, too fast, without the tools to stay present. Distance doesn't mean growth, it often means containment. That's the part that gets misunderstood, especially when avoidants appear calm, composed, and functional after a connection ends. From the outside, it can look like healing, like maturity, like emotional control. They tell themselves they're fine, that they've moved on, that it wasn't that deep. And on the surface, those statements seem convincing. There's no visible breakdown, no obvious grief, no desperate reaching back. But healing isn't the absence of emotion, it's the ability to stay present with it. Defense, on the other hand, requires distance. It requires separation from anything that might activate what hasn't been processed. What you're witnessing isn't peace, it's management. A careful structuring of emotional space so nothing spills over into awareness. If they were truly at peace, your presence wouldn't destabilize them. They could look at you without their system tightening, without the internal collapse, without the need to avert their eyes or shorten the interaction. Peace allows contact. Regulation allows connection. When someone has genuinely integrated an experience, they don't need to protect themselves from reminders of it. Avoidants often confuse emotional numbing with resolution because numbness feels quiet and quiet feels safe, but safety that requires avoidance isn't safety, it's control. They're keeping themselves functional by keeping certain emotional doors firmly shut. And you happen to be one of those doors, not because you're harmful, but because what you represent leads to rooms. They never learned how to sit inside. This is why avoidance is still a form of engagement. It takes energy to stay distant. It takes effort to remain detached. Indifference is effortless. Avoidance is active. They are constantly regulating proximity, filtering emotion, monitoring themselves so vulnerability doesn't slip through. That isn't disengagement, it's a constant negotiation with unresolved attachment. The paradox is that the more they insist they've healed, the more defensive their behavior becomes. True healing expands tolerance. It increases emotional range. It allows complexity without collapse. Defense narrows everything down to what can be controlled. Short interactions, neutral tones, limited access, all designed to prevent the nervous system from tipping into territory it doesn't know how to navigate. So when you notice the distance, don't mistake it for closure. Distance doesn't signal that the bond disappeared. It signals that it remains unintegrated. They aren't avoiding you because you no longer matter. They're avoiding you because presence would require vulnerability, and vulnerability is the one place their healing hasn't reached yet. You grew. They stayed the same. And now the contrast hurts. Growth doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up as quiet self-possession, as emotional steadiness, as no longer needing someone else to confirm what you already know about yourself. And that kind of growth is deeply unsettling to someone who relied on distance to maintain control. You didn't chase them when they pulled away. You didn't beg for clarity or reassurance. You didn't punish them with silence or resentment. You simply became self contained. You learned how to hold your own emotions without outsourcing regulation. You stopped orienting your worth around their availability. And that shift changed the entire emotional dynamic, even if nothing was ever spoken out loud. This is when they started to feel smaller in your presence. Not because you tried to dominate or diminish them, but because the balance they were comfortable with no longer existed. Avoidance often feels safest when they are needed, but not fully known. When they can move closer or farther without consequence, your independence disrupted that pattern. Suddenly, you weren't waiting. You weren't orienting around them. You were standing on your own. And they could feel it immediately. The nervous system picks up on shifts in power before the mind does. You no longer leaned in the same way. You didn't reach for reassurance. You weren't scanning their mood for cues. That absence of need is confronting to someone whose sense of control came from being emotionally central, but not fully engaged. Because when you stop needing them to validate your worth, their role changes. They are no longer the axis around which the connection turns. They become optional, and nothing threatens an avoidant more than being optional. Not because they want to be superior, but because optionality removes leverage. It exposes the relationship for what it actually is, not what distance once disguised. Feeling optional forces them to confront an uncomfortable truth. If you're okay without them, then staying away doesn't protect you. It isolates them, and isolation is the very thing avoidance was meant to prevent. But instead of moving closer, many avoidants shrink. They withdraw further, not out of arrogance, but out of insecurity. The space that once made them feel powerful now makes them feel irrelevant. Your growth didn't create this reaction, it revealed it. You became emotionally stable enough to stand without leaning, and that stability highlighted the imbalance that was always there. Around someone who is grounded, unreactive, and self assured, unresolved avoidance becomes more visible. So they feel smaller, not because you took something from them, but because you stopped giving something away. And in that contrast, they're left with a choice they've always struggled to make: step into connection as an equal, or retreat into distance to avoid being seen. If they truly didn't care, they'd have nothing to hide from. Indifference doesn't require protection. It doesn't flinch under observation or tense up in proximity. People don't avoid eye contact with strangers. They avoid it with people who see too much, people who carry information about them that can't be undone or rewritten. That's why their avoidance feels so personal. You're not just another face in the room. You're a witness to who they were, to how they showed up, to the moments they almost chose differently. Your presence activates a layer of awareness they worked hard to bury, and that awareness doesn't need words to speak. It shows itself in the body. Your existence holds a mirror they didn't consent to. Not a mirror of blame, but of truth. One that reflects missed chances they can't fully rationalize away. Emotional cowardice disguised as self-protection. Unspoken regret that never found language because acknowledging it would require accountability. You don't accuse them. You don't confront them. You don't even ask. And yet the mirror remains steady and unforgiving. Avoidants often rely on distance to soften the edges of memory. Time and space allow them to blur details, to reframe the story in a way that feels safer. But when you're physically or emotionally present, the narrative tightens. The story becomes harder to edit. They are faced with the original version of events, the one where they felt something real and chose withdrawal anyway. So they look away, not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to break the line of recognition, just enough to keep the mirror from fully forming. Eye contact would invite acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would require them to feel what they've postponed. Looking away gives them a momentary escape from the weight of self-awareness. This is the silent confession. No apology, no explanation, just behavior that reveals more than words ever could. Their avoidance isn't random, it's precise. It activates specifically around you because you hold a version of their emotional history that hasn't been resolved. If the bond were meaningless, there would be nothing to defend against. And the most telling part is this: they don't avoid everyone this way, only those who mattered. Only those who saw beneath the surface. Only those who were close enough to register on a level deeper than memory. Strangers are easy. Acquaintances are safe. But you occupy a category that doesn't fade quietly. So when they avert their gaze, don't mistake it for dismissal. It's recognition without resolution. It's the body confessing what the mind won't articulate. You aren't invisible to them. You're unforgettable. And the weight of that truth is something they haven't yet learned how to carry. An avoidant doesn't avoid eye contact because love died. They avoid it because it survived. That's the truth that takes the longest to reveal itself because it arrives without drama. No grand confession, no sudden return. What they couldn't process in real time doesn't disappear, it simply gets delayed, pushed forward into a future moment when defenses are quieter and distance no longer protects them the way it once did. What arrives later isn't longing in the romantic sense. It isn't the urge to reach out or repair. Avoidants rarely experience regret as pursuit. Instead, it comes as awareness, subtle, persistent, hard to shake. A recognition that something meaningful passed through their life and left a mark they can't erase. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. That realization doesn't show up in words, it lives in the eyes, in the way they struggle to meet your gaze, in the tension that appears the moment proximity activates memory, guilt. For an avoidant isn't loud or emotional. It's the knowledge that they withdrew, not because love failed, but because it asked for something they didn't know how to give. They understand this too late, not when you were asking questions, not when you were still available, but when the bond has already shifted into something irreversible. Time gives them just enough distance to feel what they couldn't tolerate up close. And by then, the realization has nowhere to go. It doesn't become action, it becomes weight. This is the part most people miss. The closure you were waiting for was never meant to come from them. The apology, the clarity, the acknowledgement. Avoidants rarely offer those things once the moment has passed, not because they're incapable of reflection, but because reflection arrives after access is gone, and that loss of access becomes part of the lesson. The most painful realization isn't theirs, it's yours. You don't need them to look at you anymore. You don't need recognition from someone who couldn't stay present when it mattered. You've already seen the truth in their behavior, in the patterns, in the silences that said more than words ever did. Their avoidance no longer defines you. It no longer determines your worth or your capacity to love. You outgrew the need to be understood by someone who was never available enough to understand themselves. And that's where the power quietly returns to you. They may carry the memory as guilt, you carry the experience as growth. They look away because the feeling survived. You walk away because you did, whole.